generates the text that is to be performed. So we're going to talk about exactly what the text does and what it represents. Yet in another way, the playwright is the most peripheral because they are uninvolved in the final product. It's not very common for the playwright to be involved with the production of the play, the rehearsal process, and the final product. It does happen, certainly especially with new plays, because the playwright wants to be involved to see how it's working. But once a play is established and it is finished to the satisfaction of the playwright, then they just hand it over and let directors do with it what they want. There's generally all kinds of rules that sometimes playwrights come up with. Things like you cannot change dialogue. That is pretty common. It's copyrighted, so the actors have to say exactly what's written on the page. Sometimes actors will, mess up, but that is not on purpose. So if a play is copyrighted, then you cannot change it. However, and some playwrights are very strict about the set. For example, they'll say the set design has to look a certain way, or the characters have to be cast a certain way. But usually, playwrights are pretty free when it comes to handing over their script, and they're interested to see what other people do with it and how they interpret it. So let's talk about how it's both literary and non-literary. The final form is performance. So when you go to see a play, you're not really thinking about the script. Hopefully, you're thinking about the actual production of it and what the actors are doing with it and what the designers are doing with it. So it's literary because it starts with the script on the paper, and it's definitely a text-based art form. It definitely exists in words and images that are described. But in a way, it really isn't about the words. It's about how the words are said and how the words are interpreted. It's different from a novel, for example, because in a novel, you're going to describe in words what's happening on the stage or what's happening in the story. But in a play, it's completely up to the actors and the director and the designers to create what it looks like. So you're not going to have actors saying things like, the horizon is coming up with the sun behind the window, and now I'm going to walk over to the chair and sit down. The actors aren't going to say that. They're just going to do it. So in that way, it's a non-literary activity. It doesn't have anything to do with the action of the play. The action is implied in the script. Some playwrights are going to be more descriptive of how they want the action to look, and some of them are not, so the actors have to be creative. So hopefully that clarifies the difference between literary and non-literary. The qualities of a fine play. Your book talks a lot about these. Credibility and intrigue. It's important that we help the audience get into the world of the play. We don't want to make a world so unbelievable that the actors can't identify with the characters at all, or the audience can't identify at all. So we want a staged world that's internally consistent and compelling. Speakability, stageability, and flow. There is difference between these three things, which your book goes into more detail about, so I encourage you to look at that. But basically, the words and actions have maximum impact when staged. That's the quality of a fine play. So you don't want to have words that the actors are going to be tripping over. I wrote a play one time where I tried to use the phrase, to stave off hunger. Tight belts help us stave off hunger. And literally, that makes sense, but it's hard for an actor to say that. And it sounded weird, so I had to change the wording of that. You got to think about that. And so directors and playwrights specifically will practice saying things out loud or ask other people to hear them, to say them out loud so they can see how it flows. Richness, depth in language adds authority. Depth of characterization. Characters are differentiated and made compassionately, so the characters are different. They have very strong goals and very strong personality traits that make them interesting, because we don't want to just watch people who are very closed off and not easy to tell what's driving them. Gravity and pertinence, relevance of theme to concerns of an audience and current events. So it doesn't necessarily mean that every play has to be about everything that the audience cares about, but we have to have some relevance to it. There are some plays, for example, we've talked about the postmodern movement, plays that were written right after World War II. Sometimes it's hard to get into the relevance of that. Certainly we can relate to war, but a lot of times when people do older plays like that, or Shakespeare or old Greek plays, they try to figure out how is this relevant to a contemporary audience. So if the play can be made relevant easily, then that's a quality of a good play. If there are some plays that are written about a very specific political topic, and then when that political topic is completely over, and maybe it's done with, and there's no need to revisit it, then that's not really relevant. Compression, economy, and intensity, condensation of story, consolidation of event, uniqueness of moments. You don't want to draw it out. Just like reality shows, for example, aren't really reality because they edit them way down. So you might have 15 hours of footage of young adults going out and partying, but you're only going to watch 10 minutes of it because they're going to condense it down to the most dramatic moments. They're going to put it in a structure. So even reality shows are not reality because they have to put them into a structure, just like a play has to do that. And a celebration. Theater blends art and life. If you think back to that description of what is art, art is something that is the most supreme pursuit of humanity. It is something that helps us put the fragments of our lives together in a way that makes sense, in a way that has a structure, in a way that makes people feel something and have a catharsis. And this goes back to what Aristotle said. So not saying that every show has to have a happy ending, but it is important that we can connect to it somehow. And when you write about your play that you see, this is one of the things I ask you to look for. Okay, so the playwright's process. Your textbook has some really, really great clips, cuttings from plays and descriptions of the playwrights and how they work. Not every playwright is different. There is no set formula for playwriting, and you'll see that when you read about some of the different playwrights and what they do. But all plays deal with three major areas: dialogue, conflict, and structure, and this makes sense with everything else we've been saying. Sometimes composed from remembrances, but always based in imagination. Certainly there are plays written on true stories, but they still have to have some creativity infused with them in order to make them interesting. And it takes the playwright to be creative in the way that, even if it's a true story, the way that it's being presented. The conflict, forced conflicts, raise the stakes and lead to climax. So sometimes, even if you take a true story, sometimes there are things added to it. You may have noticed this if you've seen a movie that was based on a true story and you think, oh, they're over-dramatizing this, or they threw that character in just for more dramatic effect. And yeah, they might do that because they're trying to create that structure that leads to a catharsis, that leads to conflict, that leads to a breaking point, and that leads to resolution. And so sometimes a lot of that is a little bit forced, and hopefully it doesn't feel forced, but it certainly is something that is created by the playwright. And then structure, developed consciously or unconsciously, but always carefully organized. So the playwright is always, always, always thinking about, do I need this scene? Does this scene repeat what a previous scene has done? If you ever watch director's notes or director's commentary on a DVD after you've watched a movie, sometimes they'll have outtakes of certain things or special features where they'll interview. And certainly when they do deleted scenes, for example, it might be interesting to watch that sometime and listen to the director or the writer talk about why certain scenes were deleted, because it didn't add to the structure. It somehow messed up the structure for them and they needed to take it out. So that is something that the playwright is constantly doing. And usually it involves writing everything down that they want to write and then going back and trimming things so that the structure flows well. And the last slide we'll look at gives you a really quick overview of some names that your book goes into a lot more detail about. These are some really famous current American playwrights who are writing now. David Mamet, based in Chicago, has very rough, broken dialogue centering on issues of masculinity. He has an amazing play called American Buffalo. He also is the screenwriter. He does a lot of screenplays too. Glenn Ross, if you've ever seen that. So very, very rough stuff, very realistic dialogue that he tries to capture. So it can be very broken because people don't necessarily talk in complete sentences, and he wanted to capture that. People interrupt each other, people have pauses. David Mamet is also, he's very famous for pauses, along with Harold Pinter, who we'll talk about in a minute. Tony Kushner is very famous right now. He wrote Angels in America, which was a trilogy in the 80s, a contemporary masterpiece, a sprawling play with thematic depth, fantastical structure. It has magical qualities to it, which you don't necessarily see very often anymore, but he wanted to make it very broad and sweeping. David Henry Hwang is very famous for M. Butterfly and other plays that examine sexual and cultural tensions of East and West. Neil LaBute, your book goes into a lot more detail about him. He's a highly prolific, featuring vicious dialogue. He has very contemporary plays usually about young adults and the struggles that they go through. His plays are pretty brutal and can be pretty harsh, but very, very intense. Lynn Nottage was mentioned earlier, I believe, socially invested dramas that examine multiple cultures and voices, so trying to get a structure involved that tells lots of different kinds of stories that are out there. I also have a clip for you from a Harold Pinter play. Your book has an excerpt from one of his plays, but he was famous for, again, very realistic dialogue, very lots of pauses in which the actors have to figure out what's going on. Not a lot happens in his plays. It's just people sitting around trying to philosophize. But the clip that you'll see is from a play called Betrayal, which is actually written backwards. It starts with the final scene and it goes into the past. And so you see an affair between two people, but you see the end of it in the first scene, and then you see the beginning of it in the last scene. So the clip that I have for you is about in the middle of the play. So it's very interesting, and I want you to look at how his dialogue translates to what the actors are doing, because the dialogue doesn't necessarily tell the actors exactly what's going on. They have to figure it out for themselves. So check that out.